Creation and Chaos from the series Joining with the Work of the Spirit in the season of Pentecost. This podcast is being recorded after an incredibly memorable Sunday in which we met outside near the Inglewood City Building and Amphitheater. So here's the podcast. I'd like to begin by saying that last Sunday, Carol Willis gave a master class in communication. Maggie and I agreed that it was one of the most engaging and interesting talks that we had heard in quite some time. I thought her talk about the simplicity of stuff, of time, and of speech throughout this last week, which I believe is the point of any homily. It's to inspire us to consider how do we follow the way of Jesus in the 6 days in between the homilies. If you missed it, please go back and listen to it on the podcast or look at it up in the YouTube links to listen in. Carol really did a masterful job of crafting a beautiful message. Today is Pentecost Sunday. It's the celebration of the Spirit, coming in both an intimate and an animating way to all people. The series that we are in the series of Pentecost over the next several Sundays is how do we join the work of the Spirit? It's a joy to be here with the Sacred Grace Inglewood today to share my reflections. Now, I want to begin by saying this is not the talk that I expected to give. It is also not the context in which I expected to give it, but as far as the content of the talk, on first reading and my historic recollection of the text, it led me to believe that I'd give a talk about how do we join the work of the Spirit in creating order, which if you spent time in my home or my office, you may get that order is somewhat my second nature. I like tidy. So I thought I was going to be giving a talk like how do we join the work of the Spirit is like how do we tidy up our neighbors and our neighborhoods, our friends and our families. Kind of like a Marie Kondo for Christians. And we could celebrate the works of the Spirit's role in bringing order to our lives. Now, there is wisdom and there is value in that line of logic. It's just not where the text led me this week. After 7 days of reading and rereading, of rabbit holes of theological and cultural thought, of questions and conversations, and considerably much more personal reflection than I had anticipated, I found myself writing a homily I hadn't planned. The chorus goes like this: mess is the precondition of creativity. Mess is the precondition of creativity. I'm inclined to share with you this morning that if we want to join with the work of the Spirit, we begin with messy conditions, with messy places, and with messy people, which is good news because that's all of us. Well, it's at least all of us that are being honest. We are all messy. But before I end, I want to introduce a new term that was at least new to me that I believe might help us identify and join the work of the Spirit that is in and around us. But before we get there, we're going to begin at the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now there's a spectrum of perspectives of scriptures regarding the origin and the creation text. All place God at the center as a creator, but they vary about how it occurs. There are perspectives held by people, I believe, that deeply hold to the Christian faith across the spectrum about the creation narratives. I grew up in a tradition with incredibly passionate people about a literal 6-day creation, and this was incredibly important to them. Along the way, I've had friends and mentors who have studied deeply the creation text, and they've come to more of a evolutionary process, and they've come to more of a belief in intelligent design. Now, I would like to suggest that whatever views you hold about creation and the origins of the cosmos, you would consider two things. First, does your perspective lead you to a sense of mystery and wonder, of worship about a God who creates in love this creation? And the second question is, do you hold your perspective with humility? I believe that curiosity cultivates far more learning than certitude. I wasn't there at creation, so I continue to be curious about how did the cosmos unfold. Now, I would offer that maybe you're listening in and you're not sure that there was a God who created all this, or a spirit who hovered over all of this, or even that there was a God who created you. I would hope that you would hear and see in the Sacred Grace Inglewood a community that invites you to ask the big questions about life, and that in fact you could belong even before you believe. Well, here we are, 16 words in the beginning of Scripture, and we are introduced to the Spirit of God. The poetic language of Genesis paints this beautiful picture, however we think the process unfolds, because the picture is of the Spirit that is hovering and forming a place where life can flourish. And not just any life, our life. All of creation is with an end in mind. Creation is this act of hospitality by God for a place and for a people to flourish. In these first two sentences, there are a few words that incited some of my thoughts. So I want to share some of my learning and most likely some mispronounced Hebrew with you. The first word is ruach. The word for spirit here in Genesis 1 is ruach. And there's endless articles and essays and interviews about this word. My favorite resource to recommend is the Bible Project. There's brilliant thinkers led by Tim Mackey, who, unfortunately, he spells his name wrong. It's not spelled like mine, but nonetheless, he's a brilliant thinker. And we'll just say that you can't get everything right. But Tim Mackey offers a quick summary, or I'm going to offer a quick summary of his thoughts about this word ruach in Genesis 1. He says this, quote, "In Hebrew, the word is ruach. Ruach, its first and most basic meaning throughout the Hebrew Bible is breath. It's connected with wind and energy and power and animation as well. Of course, speaking is precisely what you do when you breathe out your ruach. So you have the Spirit of God and God speaking that is releasing the ruach to bring order in creation. Now there's some complexity to God's identity that's beginning to be explored even in this vocabulary, and it's really interesting. God's ruach comes in the beginning of the story of the Bible, and ruach is its own being and has its own character out there doing its own stuff." End quote. Ruach, this word in Hebrew, means wind, which is really powerful, but also breath, which is really personal. The Spirit is the breath of God. The Spirit is written in a way that it has its own character. And we'll continue to unpack thoughts about the Spirit throughout this season and series in Pentecost. But I would say it's most important to recognize that the Spirit is both powerful and personal. Now, if we were to continue in the text and our little Hebrew lesson, there's this word that's so good. It's tohu vabohu. Tohu vabohu is the Hebrew for the part of the Genesis 1-2 where it says the earth was without form or void. Tohu vabohu. They're wonderfully poetic words in Hebrew. We even catch it how it sounds and feels. The author of Genesis is giving us an image, though. And what is that image? It's actually a watery desert, which is a contradiction on the literal level. But as an idea and as a concept, we get it. It's inhospitable and it's uninhabitable. The desert is inhospitable. It's uncultivated space, and the deep or the oceans for the Hebrew people is symbolic of an incredibly uninhabitable place. It's where you don't go. It's full of mystery and darkness. So one scholar preserves the rhyme of tohu vabohu by just simply calling it was all wild and waste. See, tohu vabohu ended up being the rabbit hole for me about this text. I never saw creation as the work of the Spirit of God that is bringing order and beauty and purpose and meaning out of the chaos. The work of the Spirit as it hovers over this chaos is not tidying it up, but it's forming beauty and purpose and meaning out of what was wildly and waste, of what was a mess. Eugene Peterson expands on this idea in his book, Under the Unpredictable Plant, about the mess of creation. He writes, quote, "The conditions in which God began to create are described in Genesis 1, without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. These continue to be the conditions in which creation takes place. I believe that over the black abyss of watery chaos, the Spirit of God is moving and breathing over the chaos of our current culture." I can't imagine any work or condition in which the Genesis 1 text is not timely for reviving the sacred rhythms in which we are privileged to participate each and every day. If we are going to be involved in God's creation work, we cannot avoid the mess. It cannot be denied, detoured, hurried through, or procrastinated about. The mess, the without form and void, is the biblical stuff of creation. End quote. When you think about it, when you write a poem, how many drafts do you throw away? Or when you paint a picture, how many tries do you do before you get it right? Or when you get married, how many years does it take before you develop the habits of the heart and the emotional maturity adequate for love? If you have a child, how long does it take you to get used to this absolute otherness of this life? Every creative act begins in the mess. Eugene Peterson writes, mess is the precondition of creativity. Mess is the precondition of creativity. And this text was timely for me this last week. The mess of life erupted at our home and required replacing our sewer line, which required removing our front yard garden, which required digging up the irrigation lines, which required me digging in mud after several days of rain over Memorial Day weekend. And when I came in from digging from the mess, my mother and I had a conversation. I grew up, my father was a preacher and would often quote scripture to me. My mother has continued the tradition of quoting scripture to me. It's such a gift. But she grew up on a farm in New Mexico, and she quoted a scripture that I had never heard. Proverbs 14:4. Where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes by the strength of an ox. Thanks, Mom. No ox, clean barn. No ox, no crops. I understand. Mom made sure I understood. Jared, the mess is how the work gets done. So if you have a clean barn, it's because you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, well, you're not getting anything done. Thanks, Mom. Maybe a quote for those of us who don't have barns and animals. Rabbi Erwin Kula wrote, if you've never had a messy kitchen, you've probably never had a home-cooked meal. If you've never had a messy kitchen, you've probably never had a home-cooked meal. Mess is how the work gets done. See, the story of God, the work of God, and the way of Jesus are always entering the mess. We see that in the continuation of Scripture that the Spirit of God is not a controlling force. We see it even more intimately in the way of Jesus as he enters into the chaos of people's lives, spiritually, physically, emotionally, and mentally, and he brings meaning and dignity and beauty and order. So to join in the work of the Spirit is to creatively enter the mess of people's lives and work for ways to cultivate a more hospitable environment for their growth and flourishing. To join in the work of the Spirit is to creatively enter the mess of people's lives and work for ways to cultivate a more hospitable environment for their growth and flourishing. When I think about the messy places that I've joined the work of the Spirit, it's so clear to me. I worked in some internally displaced people's camps in northern Uganda in the midst of the chaos of the impacts of war. I worked with a group of people, helped build a climbing wall that reordered kids' understanding of risk. I worked for 10 years with a foster care kids camp, and it was simply a summer camp experience to build positive memories in the midst of the chaos of the fractured families that foster care children were experiencing, that they had for a week order and meaning and beauty. And then I think about this last December with the Inglewood Christmas store. In the midst of the chaos of December, different than the chaos that many of us experience in December, the chaos that some of the families that participated in the Inglewood Christmas store were experiencing was, do we buy our kids Christmas gifts or do we pay rent? And in the midst of that, this community came together with others from Inglewood to help people balance the economic challenges of December by simply providing a beautiful and ordered way of providing gifts for their kids. I would offer that if you look at any individual or organization that's being led by the Spirit, you will see people hovering, not like helicopter parenting, but hovering like a hen who cares to see life flourish. It's this messy creativity is where we grow. It's where we see our neighbors grow. It's where we see our neighborhoods grow. See, the vision of the sacred grace is to see a church in and for every neighborhood in our city. And I know no better example than Nathan and Julie Hoag. And the work that they have led, that so many of you have joined, is the work of the Spirit here in Inglewood. It's being willing to creatively enter the mess of City Council and Chamber of Commerce, of defending and rebuilding Bishop Elementary, of the Inglewood Christmas Store, of Cafe 180, of the Free Little Pantry, of the Neighborhood Rehab Project, and the list goes on and on. But the work of the Sacred Grace Inglewood is this mess of this beautiful neighborhood. And the invitation for you is to join the Spirit here in Inglewood of what God is doing, or maybe look for the chaotic and messy spaces in your neighborhood. That was, for me, the invitation. It was a more intimate invitation. And maybe that's the one that would be extended to you, is that I felt like, as I reflected on the invitation to enter the mess, I thought about my daughter. My daughter, Kenna, turns 13 this month. She's in middle school. And I don't think that there's any other space that is appropriately understood as tohu vabohu, as the deep darkness, as the void without form, than middle school. But my temptation is to control that. I want to keep her life tidy. I'm inclined to so much order that it doesn't allow space for questions or mess or those moments of loss and growth and life. And the invitation for me this week in this text is to trust and to enter into this mess and the space of questions, of belonging and belief, and to trust that to join the work of the Spirit is to first and foremost enter into the messy places. So where is the Spirit of God leading you to enter into the mess? Before I conclude, I want to offer a helpful word. It's not in Hebrew, but it's about like the space that is order and mess. The word is from D. Hawk. He was the founder of Visa, like the credit card company. He came up with this word, chaotic. Chaotic, as defined, is the behavior that harmoniously exists, characteristics of both order and chaos, or it's patterned by chaos and order in a way that's not dominated by either. He goes on to say, too much chaos will lead to collapse, but too much order leads to control. And neither of those is where growth and life happens. In an individual, in an organization, or in a neighborhood. See, it's the chaotic space that we grow, that our neighbors grow and our neighborhoods grow. If you'd like to learn more about chaotic theory, I have a wonderful essay from a friend up in Vancouver that I'd be happy to share. Feel free to drop me an email and I'll share it with you. I believe that life and growth occur in this sacred overlap of chaotic space. I believe that we join the work of creation as we join the work of the Spirit in this overlap. It's where we find meaning and challenge and growth and difficulty and beauty and mystery. It is the work of Genesis 1. It is the work of the Spirit. It is the way of Jesus. If we're going to be involved in God's Spirit's work, we can't avoid the mess. The mess is the biblical stuff of creation and the precondition of creativity. So may you have the eyes to see and the courage to remain in the chaotic space, that you would join with the work of the Spirit of God in the mess.